Welcome to the first episode in a Legendarium series about the Phoenicians. In this episode, Princes of the Sea, we will talk about the rise of the Phoenician city-states, who became renowned in the ancient world as tradesmen, shipbuilders, and merchants. They became involved in the copper, tin, and slave trade before their prosperity was interrupted by the Bronze Age collapse. City-states began to form in what would become Phoenicia during the Neolithic Age, around 4000 BC, with Sidon being the first to emerge. Herodotus would record centuries later that the Phoenicians originated from the area around the Red Sea, then migrated north. Today, most scholars regard this account as a myth. But wherever they came from originally, these Neolithic farming communities grew cereals in river valleys found throughout the area and made tools from flint. They also made items from copper, which was more malleable than stone, but not much harder. In the millennium that followed, Sidon formed trade relations with pre-dynastic Egypt. However, around 3000 BC, a technological and economic leap occurred when smiths discovered that by combining copper with tin, they could create bronze, much harder than flint. This led to a global trade network, because while copper could be found relatively easily, the search for tin led men as far east as the mountains of Afghanistan and as far west as the coast of Britain, with Phoenicians often leading the way. By 2700 BC, Phoenicia had become the center of a vast trade network that fueled the early Bronze Age. Rather than a single unified kingdom, Phoenicia included a number of independent city-states that stretched along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean Sea south of modern-day Turkey. It included modern Syria, Lebanon, and northern Israel. The region possessed a number of valuable resources, most notably cedar wood. This provided the best timber for constructing royal palaces and temples, assuring that Phoenicia would always be a center of commerce and competition. By 1500 BC, the Phoenicians enjoyed the respect of great powers like Egypt for their dye manufacturing, glassmaking, and shipbuilding. For the most part, Phoenician ships followed the coastlines, which provided the safest means of navigation. But the Phoenicians also used astronomy, especially the North Star, which was known in some areas as the Phoenician Star. Indeed, there are some historians who believe that the Phoenicians could have made their way to the Americas based on some pieces of armor left behind by possible Asian travelers. However, this theory remains very much open to debate. Nonetheless, Phoenician ships were so sophisticated that their models inspired later Greek, Carthaginian, and even Roman ships. In general, the Phoenicians built two types of ships. The gauloi were built with rounded hulls and curved stems, with a large rectangular sail hanging from a yard. Sailors could turn it to catch the wind. A rudder blade shaped like an oar was attached to the left side of the ship to steer. Since it was used mainly as a merchant ship, storage space was located near the rear of the ship within the quarterdeck. On the other hand, Phoenician war ships were longer and narrower than cargo vessels, likely to hold large numbers of soldiers. These warships included two sails and coverings on the deck to hide the officers. A warship also included a forecastle at the front of the ship, used as a firing platform by bowmen or even catapults to rain missiles on enemy ships during battle. Finally, the warships used a rostrum, or a blunt tip, on the bow of the vessel to ram other ships. Like many other ancients, the Phoenicians decorated their vessels with carvings and paintings to honor the gods and the supernatural. These decorations included eyes on the prow of the ship that helped the vessel to see in stormy weather and were believed to frighten away evil spirits lurking beneath the waves. The Phoenicians also painted horses' heads upon their vessels to honor the god of the sea, Yam. Indeed, these ornate horse heads led some nations to call the Phoenicians horse people. Yam, the sea god, was portrayed as a violent, capricious, and cruel tyrant who oppressed the other gods and forced them to labor for him. Yam also tormented humankind with endless storms that made sea travel very dangerous. Yam's heroic counterpart, Baal, resisted Yam in a series of battles on the plains of heaven, said to climax with an apocalyptic struggle. To the Phoenicians, who battled so many violent storms at sea, Yam was thought to represent the terror and fear that rain, wind, and thunder could inspire. Yet the Phoenicians still honored Yam because he held the power to sink their ship or deliver it to safety based on his whim. Phoenician cargoes included copper and tin ingots, clay jars called amphorae that were filled with wine and oil, precious metals like gold and silver, glazed earthenware, and even scrap metal. However, the Phoenicians found the greatest profits in the slave trade, an economic mainstay of the ancient Mediterranean. During their travels throughout the region, the Phoenicians began keeping a lookout for unwatched and unguarded people, going ashore to kidnap them and stuff them into their holds to be sold far from home. Needless to say, this made the Phoenicians immensely unpopular, especially in North Africa, where they abducted many people. In part to avoid alienating potential customers, the Phoenicians instead began buying people at market. Typically, the Phoenicians bought prisoners of war, who were taken in frequent conflicts between tribal kingdoms. But slaves for sale could also be people who fell into debt, the unwanted children of paupers, or even people being punished for certain crimes. Upon arriving at a location where slaves fetched a high price, the slaves stood with no clothes on a platform, wearing only a tag on their neck that spelled out their age, nation of origin, special skills, and guarantees that they were in good health. Perhaps in part because of their coveted goods and trade routes, the Phoenician states found themselves caught up in wars between the Hittites and the Egyptians, the two superpowers of the day. Many states throughout the region were at least nominal vassals of one of the two great powers. Despite occasional wars, for 3 centuries the city-states of Phoenicia enjoyed their hard-earned prosperity. However, around 1200 BC, the region suffered a series of invasions and collapses in the decades leading up to the end of the Bronze Age. The Bronze Age collapse, now generally thought to have been brought about by droughts, which reduced agriculture and weakened the kingdoms, all but destroyed the powerful states in Egypt, Assyria, the Hittite kingdom, and Mycenaean Greece. For a time, the vast trade network of the Phoenicians slowed to a crawl. At least 100 years passed before the Phoenicians became one of the first states to recover from the Bronze Age collapse, not only reestablishing trade networks, but creating colonies overseas as well in a new age of prosperity. And we'll talk about that in the next episode. I hope you enjoyed this installment of the Legendarium. If you did, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, let me know in the comments section. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope that you have a great rest of the day.